All right. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Morgan, and I'm an event manager with Politics and Prose, and I'd like to welcome you all to PNP Live. Soon, I will drop a link in the chat for where you can purchase the book, The Ones Who Don't Say They Love You, straight from PNP's website. You can ask our speakers a question by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can towards the end of the event, but we apologize in advance if we don't have time to address your question. Also, there are audio captions for this event by hitting the live caption button at the bottom of your screen as well. Let's introduce tonight's guest. Maurice Carlos Ruffin is the author of We Cast a Shadow, which was a finalist for the PEN/Faulkner Award, the PEN/Open Book Award, and the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, and longlisted for the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize and International Dublin Literacy Award. A recipient of an Iowa Review Award in fiction, he has been published in the Virginia Quarterly Review, the Kenyon Review, the Massachusetts Review, and Unfathomable City, a New Orleans Atlas. A native to New Orleans, he is a graduate of the University of New Orleans Creative Writing Workshop. Ruffin will be in conversation with Disha Filyab, the author of the debut short story collection, The Secret Lives of Church Ladies, which won the 2021 PEN/Faulkner Award for Fiction, the 2020/2021 Story Prize, and a 2020 LA Times Book Prize, the Art Seidenbaum Award for First Fiction. The collection was also a finalist for the 2020 National Book Award for Fiction. The Secret Lives of Church Ladies is being developed for television by Tessa Thompson for HBO Max. She is also the author of Co-Parenting 101, Helping Your Kids Thrive in Two Households After Divorce, written in collaboration with her ex-husband. Please give our guest a virtual round of applause.
Thank you so much. Hey, Maurice.
Hey, Disha, how you feeling?
Good. I wish I had your first book handy. It's like over there. I can't reach it, but I had this one ready, which we're going to talk about tonight. So how's, book launch life so far?
It's very nice. It's giving me life, but not as much life as your glasses are giving me. They're quite amazing.
Thank you. These are my cheapy glasses. I've broken them twice and just keep replacing them. So thanks. Congratulations first. Congratulations on your second book. But I follow you on Twitter, so I feel like I almost know more about the third book, which we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about that tonight. But for the ones who don't say they love you, I was taking notes as I read. And one of the words I kept coming back to was devastating, devastated, stunning. From the very first story, the title story, I was very aware of not breathing, holding my breath. So when people say breathtaking, that is an apt description of these incredible stories and then how you've pulled them all together in this wonderful collection. So I want to talk about the stories. I want to talk about New Orleans. I also want to talk about craft. I think that's really important as well. So we're going to get into all of that. But catch us up, take us from the path of We Cast a Shadow, from there, which is a satirical novel, to this short story collection. So how did we get from A to B?
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that, Disha. I mean, look, you are a technician as a writer. So to hear you say any of those things just makes my heart beat faster. I really appreciate that.
You're welcome.
I feel like I don't really know why I do what I do craft-wise until after it's out into the world. Mm-hmm. When I look back at We Cast a Shadow, I think what I was trying to do with that is that it was like a blues album. I was trying to create something that replicated the feeling of being a Black person in America. So if you're Black and you read it, you kind of go, oh, I get this. I know what this is like. I feel this all the time. Mm-hmm. If you're white, you might go, oh, I didn't know it was that bad. But then you see the George Floyd and everything happened in 2020 with Breonna Taylor, yada, yada. You go, oh, it really is like that. Well, that's how it feels. Mm-hmm. With The Ones Who Don't Say They Love You, is a short story collection that I actually started writing well before We Cast a Shadow. I very much had a feeling as somebody from New Orleans who had looked around my hometown. I've been here my whole life, pretty much. I noticed that there wasn't a lot of fiction from out of New Orleans, which was shocking to me because it is a very, it's a town full of storytellers. And when I really thought about it, and I said to myself, Maurice, why aren't there more novels and collections coming out of your hometown? Well, it's pretty obvious. I mean, it's white supremacy, it's mass incarceration, it's poverty, it's literacy. And, first it kind of shut me down, to be perfectly honest. I was kind of like, you know what? I'm not in the business to even write all these stories because I'm just me. I'm not all these people. And then when I thought more about it, I said, Maurice, if you don't write anything, then there's nothing. Nothing's gonna come out. So I wanted to represent my hometown as much as possible. So there's 19 stories in it. And I want to make sure to cover a wide gamut of people who you don't ever get to see. People think that they know New Orleans, but you don't get to see like the lady in the last story who was a middle-aged lesbian who was like just trying to live her life and save her house, or like a little teenage trans girl who was like protecting her best friend throughout that story, Rhinoceros. And I have to say, just quiet as kept, your work has been influencing everybody. So even though a lot of these stories were written before you came onto the scene with your book last year, I think that you've been so much of a part of making us all work harder, be more honest, and more direct. So thank you for your work.
Thank you. Thank you. Gosh, your answer, I got like 3 questions that are like follow-ups to that, but I think I'm going to stick to my sequence. So the characters in the novel, I have a friend who, she was the first person I ever heard use the word voicey to talk about a story. And I kind of knew what she was talking about because she was describing her own work as voicey, and it is. But then as I was reading, I was like, oh, this is voicey. This is voicey. I mean, every character, the characters are a diverse group of New Orleanians, but their voices set them apart, and I could hear them. And through voice, I'm immediately pulled into the story. But I'm curious about this from a craft and process standpoint. Is that how the stories come to you? You hear your characters first, or is it their situations, or does it vary?
Yeah, I mean, it can vary to the extent that I might have like a time and a place. So the title story, I kind of knew, all right, there's this young man who is in the French Quarter, and it's hot, and it's New Orleans in the summertime. And I remember writing the initial first page or so of that and being like, well, this is a great concept, the voice ain't right. In another story, like for example, Ghetto University, that one is kind of the one that is like the most autobiographical in terms of like my own voice and in terms of like the situations and that kind of thing, except for the mugging part. I'm not repping myself out. But like even with that one, it's kind of like, all right, this voice isn't quite right. And I recognize that in my writing, invariably, it's not until I go back to like the first couple of pages and try and listen really hard. And I'm hearing like my cousins, my elders, my ancestors, people I met in the grocery store. And I kind of go, well, who amongst the voices that I know what this person sounds the most like? And I begin to incorporate that. And that allows me to make people who are very diverse from myself. So my personal voice is just what it is, but New Orleans voices are very unique.
Yep. And even, the character, the narrator in Ghetto University, even though he has this sort of almost affected kind of voice, I still was ready to root for him, even though, his voice sort of put up a bit of a barrier. There was not the same kind of intimacy. And so, that was just a quality of all of the characters. It made me want to root for them. And, I mentioned before, the characters and voices created this sort of intimacy and this immediacy where from the first sentence, first paragraph, you're in the world. And so from a craft perspective, and this is something that I still really work on, I will write pages and pages and pages just to figure out how does this story start, or who is this and why are they doing, the things that they do. Because, when I was first writing, I had, was plagued with what a lot of new writers are plagued with. You have all this backstory, and you want people to kind of understand. But there's this trust that you seem to have in the reader or maybe that's my interpretation. How do you get away from all of the backstory, or what one writer called the had horrors. You know, you're telling us everything that had happened, but instead just bring us in the moment.
Well, I mean, you're right about that. And again, I feel like in your work, you're so good at just getting us into it and making us be a part of the present of the story. And then you'll give us, backstory and context and subtext. It's that feeling of, like Martin would always say, what happened was, or Will Smith, what happened was, I think a lot of new writers are always starting out with that. Let me give you 2 or 3 pages of the backstory first.
Yeah.
It took me a long time to get out of that habit. So I think that, look, we're not making visual arts, we're making literature. So it's on the page. And there's no actors reading it usually, unless it's an audiobook or something like that. And so I just decided that I didn't want to give readers a chance to like get tired or bored or kind of go, this is not my jam.
Yeah.
If I could have the voice be just right there in their face from the very first line, in as many of these stories as possible, then the stories would thrive. And so so that feeling of, look, it's okay for the readers to be maybe even a little confused for a couple pages, and then figure out things by context as the character reveals who she is, or as the situation becomes more and more clear throughout the story. Give a little backstory later on in the story versus trying to set it all up. And readers are smart. I mean, look, writers are smart, and people who love literature are smart, so they'll figure it out most of the time.
Right. And you make it so compelling that I want to keep going. So, if I do have questions, you will answer them. So there's always this payoff,
Yes.
Speaking of, figuring that stuff out, who do you read you might read them for pleasure and craft, but who do you read for craft? So like, I'm trying to learn to write better satire. So I'm reading you, I'm reading Rian Amilcar Scott, I'm reading Nafisa Thompson Spires, I'm rereading all of you all, Paul Beatty. Who do you read for craft?
Well, certainly all those people.
Okay.
But every book is different. So it's a different set of writers that I'm reading for it.
Okay.
So I remember Toni Morrison was talking about how when she was an aspiring writer, before she was even an editor, she talked about being, somebody who read a lot of Faulkner. I remember being like, wait, Faulkner? William Faulkner? Racist Bill Faulkner? That kind of thing.
Right.
And I used to be a part of a group that was together for a long time. It was all Black writers and writers of color. And we would have these debates about who should you be reading to get that life. And one of my friends who I love and respect was like, well, I pretty much only read Toni Morrison and a few other people. I'm like, okay, that's kind of jacked up, because she said, read a variety of things. Those influences are so helpful. So like, even with the book that I'm writing now, my 3rd book that you mentioned, I talked about on Twitter, it's going to be hilarious when I finally wrap it up and like, go on tour or whatever. People are like, Maurice, I read somewhere you said that this book was heavily inspired by Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. And it's true, because, in my first book, I very much was trying to have a sort of overarching plot. And a lot of the short stories, I make them tight and fast. But in this newer book, which is in 3 parts, a big part of it is this sort of flowing narrative that is less about plot and more about situation, voice, and experience, how the characters feel. And Wolf, for my money, is like one of the best at that. At the same time, you mentioned everybody, Nafisa, Rian, and the rest of them. I mean, I remember when I read Nafisa's story about the 2 mothers writing letters back and forth.
The letters, yes.
Oh my God, that's
Classic.
one of the funniest stories in the history of all literature. And I kept thinking, I got to catch up to her somehow. This is amazing. And so, I always say that, particularly amongst us sisters and brothers, we're all holding hands, and it's been fun to watch everybody come out in the past few years and like, all right, we're doing this thing. It's like the A-Team. It's like the Avengers or something,
Yes. Somebody, people will say things like, I read such and such and it made me never want to write again. And it's like, I read y'all and it's like, it makes me want to write, because it's like, it reminds me of what I love about stories. Yes. It reminds me of like all these possibilities. And it's like, I want to try something new. I never thought about satire until reading you all. And it's like, okay, I want to, try my hand at that. So we lift each other up, we inspire each other, we challenge each other. And, and I'm really grateful for that.
See, I'm sweating to see your satire, because I know it's going to be dope.
Thank you for the vote of confidence.
Well, also, I feel like a lot of this stuff, like when I read your books, like I read your book and I read Nafisa's, it's almost like double Dutch. And it's like, you clap your hands and jumping around, the rope is going, I'm like, I want to get in on that too,
Yes,
I can't double Dutch in real life. I want to be a part of that experience.
Exactly. And and it's something that Kiese Lehman and our friend Robert Jones Jr., we talk about seeing each other through the lens of care and community and not competition. And I think that's what it is,
Absolutely. 100%.
And a lot of us that I just mentioned, not all, but a lot of us are Southerners. And your book is firmly planted in New Orleans, in the voices and the characters, in the situations. Hurricane Katrina is almost a character in some ways, as a thread that runs throughout the stories. And it reminded me of how that there are many Souths, so I'm Southern, but I'm Florida Southern.
Yeah.
I'm also Florida Southern, and I haven't lived there, for half my life, but that was where I was born and raised. And so there was a lot of Southernism. We were joking earlier in the green room about pure D. And so when there's certain expressions and things that I see, it's just like, this is home, this writing is home, this story is home. So you talked a little bit already about, wanting to represent New Orleans with these stories. Do you think, or have you heard from New Orleanians? Do they feel seen in these stories?
I have been hearing that. That's my first mission, is that,
yes.
I mean, I said it when we cast the shadow, but I really mean it even more with the ones. It's kind of like, my dream is that in a city that has so many impediments, like I mentioned, to writing literature, I'm hoping that young people in particular, young people in high school or in college, if they have aspirations to write their own work, they'll read my work and be inspired. They'll go, well, if that guy can do it, certainly I can do, twice as good as that. And I want to see in New Orleans where, we're known for our music and our food and everything else, that all these natural storytellers just start putting their work down on the page, getting it out. And so I have been hearing people say, I've never seen this before. And that's telling me that it's opening their eyes to the possibilities of what kind of stories come out of my hometown.
Yes, absolutely. So I know that you've written that the stories span about a decade of writing.
Right.
And is it a decade that preceded, or is it a decade that followed Katrina, or was Katrina in the middle somewhere? How did it influence the collection?
Yeah, so the oldest story in the collection, which is The Pie Man, I think I actually started that in 2007. That's longer than a decade. That's supposed to be 15 years. And that story was one of my very first stories I ever wrote. It took me like multiple redrafts in like 5 years. I didn't know what I was doing at all. I just kept trying to figure it out. I think one of the reviewers in the LA Times pointed out that they think it's based on Faulkner's Dry September, which is true. And so I was reading that story and kind of thinking, well, what happens if you take these white guys who are falsely accusing a black person of a crime and you transfer it to New Orleans in 2007, where we had conflict at that time between black folks and Latinx people coming into town. And so I'm like, nobody's talking about this. I just want to see how it might play out in fiction. So there was that story. Then some of the stories I wrote within the past maybe 2 years. So that's Rhinoceros, that's the novelette, Before I Let Go. Token is like that, very, very new. And then of course, in the actual chronology of the city, when the stories span many decades, I think one is set in the 70s, one is set in the 80s, a couple are set in the 90s, and then one is set like in 1866. And that's Cesar Picnic. Exactly. Thank you. And so, like if I would have, so to me, it was just fun to like be able to show the city in different times.
You mentioned The Pie Man. And that was one where, again, I'm holding my breath and I'm saying, no, don't,
Don't do it, baby, don't do it.
Exactly. I want to just hug everybody, so I don't, without giving any kind of spoilers. This is something else that I think a lot of writers grapple with, including myself. Do you feel any pressure at all for a happy ending somewhere, anywhere? I was like, is there any way he cannot do what he's about to do at the end of that story?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is like temperament. Like a lot of my friends who are sort of on the commercial bestseller list, they're writing like these happy endings. And you're like, oh, right. And, everybody has $1 million when the story is over and they're married up and having babies and stuff. And I think maybe as a quote unquote literary writer, I'm either doing one of two things. I'm kind of showing you how life can be grinding in some situations while showing you the humanity of the character.
Yes.
Or I'm writing these sort of open-ended endings where you kind of go, this might turn out good for them. I mean, it wasn't looking good before it stopped, but it might turn out good for them. I like that effect.
Yeah, you had me. I was thinking for a while, and then you just devastated me. I'm going to keep coming back to that word. So something about a lot of Southern writing, my own writing, food, lots of food in the stories, and then hunger. Like I felt like that was a theme that was, throughout the stories. And I know for myself, there's a lot of food in my collection, and that wasn't conscious. Was it conscious for you? You're writing around food?
Well, I think that, so I'm a former corporate lawyer, for those who don't know it. And so, I've had the experience of being around wealth. And New Orleans is a very partitioned city, and that there's definitely different classes, and a lot of that sort of wealth disparity, not surprisingly, is about race, it's about white versus black. I think for my wealthy friends, like for them, like showing care is often about, like I had one friend, we're gonna hop on a plane and go down to a private island for a weekend. Like, wait, what? But I think for our people, it's often, look, come over to my place, like Galia and Before I Let Go says, I'll make you some gumbo. I'm gonna feed you, and then they have other characters who are literally starving. I mean, like the girl in Fast Hands, Fast Feet, she's on the street. She hasn't had like a hot meal in probably a week or so, I think she said.
Yes.
And so I just think that, there's the culture of the food that Black folks have created over centuries based upon our ancestors' work. And then it's just this literal like desire to just not starve, to be fed both literally and metaphorically. Yes. So I can't not have that in most of the stories. It's a part of what I have lived, what I've seen.
Yeah. You use a second person point of view in a number of the stories. And it just, again, I just sort of fell into it. And then I realized, wait a minute, are all of these stories? And then I started going back and looking, and it creates this intimacy. And I also love writing in second person. Is that something you've always done as a writer, always experimented with?
I think the way it started was literally, I remember being in my MFA class, I went to the University of New Orleans, creative writing workshop. And somebody just kind of said one of those comments where like somebody will say something, but they don't have any like backing for it. And they said, well, I think second person is overblown. People are using second person constantly. Now, I was reading pretty heavily. I haven't read any second person things, except for some parts of, I think, Junot Diaz's first novel, where he used that a lot there. And I'm like, okay, I'm the kind of person, if you say don't do something, I'm gonna do it, to like show you what.
And who's to say it's too much? Like, right?
There's no such thing. And also, like, I think particularly if you have a character who's very young, or that person is like just very, very stressed out. That kid in the very first story, title story, like he's on the streets, he's trying to survive, he's got a good heart, everything is against him. And it's almost as if like you, the reader, like you're just like standing next to him on the street. He's like, you out on the street, there's lemonade and water, being spraying your thing, and you do this, you do that, you do that. It's like somebody's kind of saying, what is your life like? He can't even say I, because he can't even see himself that much. He is like so disassociated from who he really is. He's just like keeping his eyes down, being like, well, and you go home and you buy some chicken, and you that. He's just talking like that to the reader.
I had not thought about it that way, but that makes perfect sense. And that story, you said earlier about writing about New Orleans that people outside of the city don't always see. What I was experiencing, and I've only been to New Orleans twice, which is not nearly enough, is I feel like you, even the people that we do see, you showed us them, in 3 dimensions. Which brings me to something else you touched on already. You write about people who are marginalized, and they're specifically marginalized in ways that you personally aren't. And, in the larger cultural discourse, we talk about appropriation. How do you approach writing about characters who are marginalized in ways that you aren't?
Yeah, well, I'm just going to say it. I think one of the biggest problems in the community, especially amongst Black males, is homophobia and the way that many Black men think about queer people. And, I had a choice. I could just kind of like, well, all right, there's this appropriation issue, just don't have any in the book. And it's certainly not any lead character.
Right.
But I think as a writer, it's my job to be honest about what my city really is. And I think, nobody really ranks cities in terms of like, queerness, but, you could argue that maybe San Francisco and New Orleans are like the top 2 queer cities. The huge parades, entire parts of the city are sort of devoted to people who are part of that community. You know, it's the mission over there. It's big parts of like the French Quarter and Trinity over here. And so I was kind of like, Maurice, look, make a choice, and if it's an issue, it'll be an issue. But you know, I'm happy to say that people who've been reading these characters, you know, Roxane Gay, for example, she was one of the very first reviews that popped up on Goodreads, and I was like, all right, Roxane says it's all right, I know it's all right. and you know, it's just really like, it's not the issue that the majority of Black people, or Black men in particular, are homophobic, but there's just too many of us, and there's not enough challenge to that mindset. So I want to be a part of that. You know, I want to be a part of people saying, look, you know, these are our fellow brothers, sisters, and non-binary people. They have stories to tell too, and you know, this book is a time capsule of this city over a period. If I didn't have them in the book, it wouldn't be an honest book at all.
Right. And I think, you know, one of the things about appropriation is, or, you know, writing about experiences that aren't ours specifically, is the issue of harm, you know. And as you said, you know, we can make these attempts, we can write and be willing to hear when we do mess up. You know, I think it was Colson Whitehead that said at a conference once, like, he likes to make Korean fried chicken. And he was talking about appropriation, and he was like, as long as it's good, nobody cares.
Yeah.
You know,
it's true. It's true.
When you mess it up, then, you know, and you know, by extension, I would say when you do harm, then you have to be willing to be accountable for that. And so, you know, I think that it's, you know, the visibility. I've gotten asked that question about, you know, the queer folks and stories in my book. And it's not something as flimsy as representation, or which sort of veers into tokenism, but it's this organic piece that you're talking about. You can't tell the story of this place or this world without telling the story of everybody who's there. You know, it's not.
Yeah, and look, I'll tell you like how slow I am, because I remember when I was in grad school, there's always this issue of like, how do you write a universal story? You know, and I remember when I first got to grad school, I wouldn't even like give any indicators of my character's race. You know, they were like every woman, every man. You know, and looking back, it's like, Maurice, what were we even trying to do? That's impossible. You know, and so as I became more aware of like the duty of somebody who is writing about a place to have people represented properly, it just became much more clear to me. It wasn't even a question by the time I wrote these stories.
That word you just used, duty. You know, we don't hear a lot of writers using that word. You know, and you know, what is our duty? What does it mean? I like to talk about to be a good literary citizen. You know, I think those are the kinds of questions that are part of this question around, you know, who gets to write what experiences. Let's see. Okay, we're doing good on time. So I was texting with someone today who said, I just saw, I think that she saw Kiese, she saw you, and she said, and Maurice is the nicest man in America. And
good take.
And I had already had a note in my list of questions here to talk to you about this, that I have decided, well, there was a vote, you know, I'm here to tell you, you have been voted the nicest person on Twitter.
Okay.
Your Twitter feed is just so uplifting and so encouraging. And, you know, you give craft advice, you give life advice, but it's all in a way that's so, you know, genuine and inviting. And, you know, you really are the nicest person on Twitter. How did that happen? Because Twitter is not a nice place.
Twitter is not a nice place. It's not a nice place at all. And it's somebody who has been on Twitter since about 2008, I think. And I had a previous account that I shut down around 2015. You know, I've seen it change. I think that it was a scattered environment at first. Then it became this sort of like people telling jokes all the time. Then when the prior president came in office, it got very dark very fast. And I watched that happen. I was like, I gotta get out of here with this. I started a new account, and I had honestly been trying to decide like what is the identity of it. And long story short, I just said, you know, you are responsible for the energy you put into the world. You are always like adding to the strife and the discord, just like saying negative things constantly. You're gonna get that, you know, back in your own life, you know, 2 or 3 times fold. And so I've made a conscious decision, definitely in the past, you know, year or so, to try and put out the kind of feeling that I want in my life, which is, you know, I hope you have a good day. You know, if you're trying to write, it's going to work out. Just keep on going. You know, I hope that you are working to improve yourself, that you're doing things for other people other than yourself. That whole vibe is just something that, I believe in truthfully, and I'm just putting it more in print on Twitter now than I used to do in the past. And, frankly, I couldn't have known how much people would respond to it. People, I think I gained like, 3,000 followers like in a month after I started, that plus the Avatar project too. And people have just been so positive, like, thank you for saying this. I need to hear this today. Thank you for your presence. And that's what I want to hear. I want to be the kind of person who leaves everything better than I found it. However I can do that, whether it's literarily or in social media or in the real world.
So you mentioned the Avatar project. So for people who aren't familiar with it, can you talk about that? It's a lot of fun, and I really appreciate that too.
Yeah, I mean, I've always tried to do this thing where, like, I try to show respect for my ancestors and for different groups, and so I've always had like a Black History Month Twitter feed where I would say, on this day this thing happened. I want to give a shout out to this ancestor, yada yada yada. And then this year, for the first time, I said I'm gonna try to do that for Women's History Month also. And then meanwhile, I had just discovered this face app where you can superimpose your face on anybody else's face. And so I started putting like pictures of me as like Dora the Explorer, or like me as like Dolly Parton. And people were like, man, is he losing his mind? What's wrong with Maurice? And just, I think it was as an artist, it's always more complicated than you can explain. But I know that a part of it was that the book I'm writing now is very much about my women ancestors, like fictional stories of their lives going back to the early 1800s. And to like get in a certain headspace, I wanted to see their faces. So I took my face and sort of made different versions of it in different eras, the 1860s, the 1940s, and so on. And so it just became this whole big thing. And people were, I said in one of my tweets that like a lot of like the sort of aggressive, angry guys who were on my feed disappeared. Like nice little old ladies appeared. I love that feeling. That's what you want.
Right. And I think it kind of ties back to what you were talking about earlier around, homophobia, and if I may even suggest toxic masculinity, that your willingness to do this, and it's always women, so people know that you did continue it beyond Women's History Month, but it's always, women, historical figures that you superimpose your face onto. And I think if people are uncomfortable, they should ask themselves why. And so you're kind of doing with this project what you do with your stories, which is encourage people to kind of investigate why they have the feelings they have about certain situations. You mentioned earlier about your first book and how you heard how you wrote it and how Black people responded, and then how white people responded. And I know it's kind of early-ish yet for this second book. Is it a similar kind of dynamic?
It is early. I think what I've noticed so far is there's kind of like some unanimity to how people respond. I think people who have read the book already, which is still early, and responding are saying, yeah, this is New Orleans. This is New Orleans that I've experienced in my life. These are these people that I know so well. So I've heard a lot of that. And I think that maybe from Black folks, it's been like, thank you. I haven't seen this before. I said in the past, this city is now 303 years old. And like for this to be the first book of short stories out of my city by a Black person, published by a national publisher, it sounds impossible, but as far as I can tell, it's the truth. And so I think there's some of that appreciation there as well. I do think though that like the whole, what's that phrase, the Overton window has shifted because of last year's events, where everybody's paying more attention to books by Black writers, Black lives, Black stories. And so I just think that it was a great time to release this book because New Orleans is one of the Blackest cities in America. I mean, it's like us, there's Atlanta, Detroit, and a few other places. And so I just think that people are really appreciating that these stories are coming out right now.
A number of the stories in the collection are flash, and the brevity of some of them is what added to, I think, the impact. And they lingered with me longer because they left me with questions, not in an unsatisfied kind of way, but again, in the best sort of way. I asked this for myself as a person who doesn't write a lot of flash, but I'd like to write more. How on earth do you know when it's done? I'm like, oh, well, there it goes. I thought this was going to be flash. Now we're,
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, flash fiction were those are the first real stories that I wrote. Like a few of them, like let me think. So I have this story in here that is called Mercury Forges, and I probably wrote that story around the same time as Pie Man. And I was trying. So what was happening was when I was starting to write short stories years ago, it just kept going on and on and on and on. It wasn't like there were going to be a novel. I just couldn't figure out how to stop the stories.
Yeah.
And I came across some stories by a writer named Paul Thoreau in an anthology, and he had made 22 flash fiction pieces. And I'm a nerd, like I have a sort of engineering mind too. I'm like, all right, what is he doing? Now he had a formula. He didn't state what the formula was, but I saw it as like a sort of a setup, a complication, a twist, and a conclusion. And so I used that formula to make my flash pieces. And so what happens is they just sort of naturally went in. Like you have this sort of twist moment where you're like, oh my God, what's going to happen? And you can like have a moment, like a beat past that, or you can stop right then. And that's a satisfying ending if there's a good visual in that point. And so, you know, I've used that for my flash and for my longer stories. And I just find it's very effective to sort of contain things and keep them very, you know, tight.
And because you're the nicest person on Twitter, you shared that formula this week.
Well, I mean, my friend shared it, then I retweeted it.
Okay. Because I guess I didn't read it carefully because I thought it was just stories and, you know, fiction and just stories in general. I didn't realize that was the flash formula.
The flash formula.
Yes. And we talked a little bit about this, but so my last question before we open it up to the Q&A, and folks, please put questions in so that we can get these questions to Maurice. You talked a bit about being in a writers group. Is that, if I'm saying it right, the Podunk Writers, is that the group? Okay.
Yes.
And we've talked about, you know, some writer friends that we have in common and sort of informal writing community. Can you talk about the role of community and how you've developed as a writer, grown as a writer in community?
Yeah, I mean, everybody's different. I think community is really important for most writers. Podunk is one of the groups. I co-founded that group in 2007. The group that I mentioned earlier that was mostly people of color, that one was called the Melanated Writers of New Orleans. And we were around for maybe 4 years, give or take. It sort of naturally came to an end. But I just think that, like, I know that for me personally, in my experience, when I started writing by myself, I felt like I was blind. I couldn't see beyond the tunnel. And as I found more and more writers, and we would start to share work and we talk about our ideas, the world went from like monochrome to color, you know, technicolor. It became more beautiful. And I mentioned earlier the idea that, you know, the fact that I am a former corporate lawyer, people often will say that, oh, you know, writers like introverts and they keep to themselves. But I found that in comparison, writers are incredibly warm-spirited people and very giving people. And so just, you know, everything that I've learned as a writer is because I know writers. It's because I will ask questions, have conversations, go to events, go to readings, go to conferences. And I think that anybody who's just getting started in particular, you definitely want to make it a point to reach out and make connections, because people who have some experience will talk to you. Yes. And you can be a mentor of people who are coming up behind you. That's all a part of the process. We're all, you know, walking in a straight line towards the future. And that's right. I feel good to be a part of this whole earth-wide writing community.
All right. And I am happy to be in community with you. Let's see, for the last question, I got a couple more, but let's see. I think the one that I want to ask is, I asked about who you read for craft. Who are you reading, or who have you read recently for pleasure?
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
Or do you have time?
No, I mean, look, you know, I was in Mississippi for 10 and a half months, and the idea was to be there and write and read a lot. I taught one class, but I read a lot last year, going into the summer period. And I do want to, before I forget, thank you, Deisha, for doing this. I really appreciate your presence and your work in this moment.
My pleasure.
Thank you. And also to Politics and Prose as well for having all of us here tonight. I really appreciate this platform. You know, for pleasure. So, you know, again, I'm always trying to find my blind spots. And so about a year and a half ago, I recognized that I wasn't reading like sort of like popular commercial books by Black women and women of color. So I bought like a whole like stack of them. I bought Such a Fun Age. I bought Celeste Ng's Little Fires Everywhere. I bought Miracle Creek, and a few other books. And like just reading those books is so much fun because they are designed to go very fast, just to move. So I was surprised because I think, like, you know, sometimes you sort of get into your own self. Well, I'm not the kind of guy who reads those kinds of books. But I just was like, yo, these writers, they're all amazing. They are amazing. And then one that was more pleasant than I thought it was going to be. It was extremely pleasurable. Was Homegoing, which I kept thinking is like gonna be like a very serious, sort of like stolid book. And I was like, no, this book is a ride. I love that. I mean, I read so many books in the past year, but those really stand out, I think.
Okay. All right. Let's see. So we have several questions in the chat. I'm going to try and answer one. Oh, okay. Yeah. One of my questions that I didn't get to will somebody ask. So this is a two-part. I know it's like asking like your favorite, parent or child. Do you have a favorite story and or character in the collection?
Oh my goodness. You got to give me a second with that one. I'm going to go to the table of contents. So I can't necessarily say that there's a favorite story or character, but I will say that there's some that I think about more than others. And I think one of the ones that I think about a lot is Catch What You Can on page 113. And the reason why, that story is probably the most autobiographical story. It's about a young boy and his mother. And it's the 1980s, and just things happen. And to be honest, like that's a lot of what me and my mom look like. She's still alive, we're great friends. And it's the kind of thing where I was trying to represent her on the page, which is she's a real complex person. So I think in that story, you have these striving characters who are trying their best despite their own limitations. And I just, I have a heart for that kid as if I'm seeing myself 30 years ago and thinking, it's going to be okay. Just keep it together. Keep showing love for each other. So I have so much respect for her. I mean, she went through a lot in her life that led to her being the way that she was back then. So I think about that a lot with a lot of the characters. I mean, the girl with fast hands, fast feet, she's so scrappy and is like trying to live her life.
Yeah.
Two teenagers and rhinoceros, that's the last thing I wrote in the book. And it was like set during the George Floyd protests here in New Orleans. And me seeing these actual young people out on the streets, being a part of those protests and thinking, what are their stories? And so there's so many, it's too many to pick really, honestly.
Okay. Well, I will say my the novelette is is my favorite. I mean, from the title, first of all, you call it Before I Let Go, I was already all in, but
I really appreciate that. And I had no idea that that podcast with Wesley Morris, they did an episode on that song. And I happened to call in as a listener to talk about the song, and the book was coming out at the same time. But I think with that story in particular, what I love about that story is that I just wanted to give her as much space as possible. Again, I've never seen a middle-aged, gay Black lady from this city get like an actual story. That's just, she's not a secondary character. This is her life and her words. And so I have so much love for her. And that's why she gets the most space, and she gets like the closing act of the entire book.
And what I love is not only does she get her own story, but in her story, she's at the center. She has a daughter, but her daughter's not her life. Her daughter, she loves her daughter, but she's peripheral. And I was just in love.
She has two love interests in that story. She's got a daughter, she's got multiple bosses, but it's all about her and her life.
That's right. Okay, we have a question this is a really good one. Who do you consider your best reader? Is it other writers, your friends and family, and why?
Ooh, that's a good question. Who would that be? So I feel like I have many great readers. So, for example, my agent PJ Mark is a great reader. He's the person who reads it when I think it's just about done. And he's going to look at it and kind of go, "You're not done," because I need to hear that often.
Yeah.
My friends in my writing group have been a big part of my writing process now for well over a decade. I can name check a few of them, whether it's Emily Stadd or Tad Bartlett or Ben Morris and others who each have their own strengths. Like one is the best editor, one is the best cheerleader, one is the best questioner. But it's going to sound kind of funny, right? It is about community. There's no doubt about that. But I think that one of the things I gained I did not have like even maybe 6 or 7 years ago, was I became my own great reader. That now I also see my tendencies, and I kind of go, "You're doing that thing again, Maurice. You've done it too many times. So don't do that." So that now, by the time it gets out of my hands into like my first reader's hands, it's a lot cleaner and smoother. And I think that as a writer, you want that. So you want them to get a version that is the strongest version, so they can go through it. But I've been lucky to have, I mean, like dozens of readers. And frankly, you know, I'm married. My mom reads my stuff as well. Now they're like my last readers. Like, they'll say the finished product after it's been like, you know, cleaned up and made, you know, as shiny as possible. I kind of go like a cat bringing a mouse to the house. You know, here, drop this book in their lap and kind of go and read this and see what you think about it.
And you know, it's something really important that you said about they're cheerleaders. There's a place for cheerleaders, but then there's also a place for you as your own reader. And that means you have to know where you're not your strongest, know your, you know, areas for growth and things like that. And I think that represents maturity as a writer, because in the beginning, I don't know if you're anything like me, I just wanted people to like it. You know, I thought that's what a reader was supposed to do. And you know, that's not all you want. Someone wants to know about your process. Are you, I love this phrase, a discovery writer, meaning you kind of write and discover as you go along, or do you prefer to plot before drafting?
I think that most writers will always give like a very simple answer, but I think that most writers, it's a mixture of things. I mentioned the LA Times review, so that was the review where I feel like the reviewer was reading my mind, like they sort of knew what I was doing. You know, with this book, and I think with most of my writing, I'm very much about improvisation. Like I don't know what's going to happen. I'm not sure what's going to happen, like in the various acts of the story or a book, or how it's going to end. I don't really know that for a fact. But what I will do is, like maybe about halfway into a story or into a book, I will do what I call a nutshell plot, where I will sit down, I'll go back and I'll go, okay, Maurice, you've written a little bit so far. What do you think this whole story is? And I'll start from the very beginning again. And like in one page, right, really fast, this story starts with so-and-so doing this thing. They go to this place, do this thing, they see so-and-so, they had a little discussion, yada, yada, yada. And I was like, race to the end of that, like a little sort of like miniature synopsis. And as I'm doing that, I'm kind of going, oh, that doesn't add up. Well, you should move this part over here. No, cut that part out. Then I'll continue writing, make a full draft, sit it down like on like a pie on a windowsill, let it cool for like a week or two. Come back to it, print it up, go through with a pen, start making like easy corrections to it. Put those in. As I'm making the corrections, the simple corrections, I started seeing bigger things, kind of going, okay, what's really the problem here? I get lucky sometimes where like a story is like almost like perfect in its first or second draft. So like the title story was kind of like that. I wrote it like, you can't be done. It's been like 5 days you wrote the story. I mean, there's no way. I was like, no, make like one change, send it off. So that story was kind of like that. But the point is like, there's no one process. It's use what works for you. I do know that I'm not the kind of person to sit down and plot the entire thing out in the beginning and then follow that throughout the writing process. I have friends who can do that, like my boy Daniel Jose Older. You know, my other friends who like write very sort of like fantasy, you know, or sci-fi books, and it works for them. Amy Vincent is a friend of mine who does it as well. But I can't do that. I think as a literary writer, it's like a jazz song. You're just letting the notes flow and making the melody make sense over time.
Thank you. Here's another question. Do you ever write your way through experiences or something that's happening in the world that you're struggling with? And are there stories you've written that have helped you find your own way?
Yes, 100%. A couple of years ago, I got a master's in psychology. And I can say out loud, I've never been in therapy myself. I think it's a good idea. But I will say that as somebody in my 40s now, when I was in my early 30s, I had a lot of struggles, just like general things, anxiety, depression, whatever you want to call it. And I did notice that when I would give my characters issues that I was struggling with myself, whether it was relationship problems or career problems, and let it play out on the page, when I would think back months later after the story was finished, my problem felt smaller. So I do think that writing a story can be one type of therapy for a person to lower the temperature on what you're dealing with in your own life. I think that that's a very sort of particular thing that we writers have in our tool chest for self-care. It's a privilege to like write your way out of a personal issue. And so I think that, you know, it's the reason why so many like really accomplished writers are like, they're just so chill. They're like written like a lot of their big problems already into the books, you know?
Yes.
And I've just seen it time and time again for myself. No doubt about it.
You've mentioned that you were a corporate lawyer. And what was your transition like from being a corporate lawyer to being a creative writer? What did you take from that prior experience that uniquely benefits your writing process?
Yes. And pardon the thunder in the background. There's a storm passing through New Orleans. It's a tropical climate, so we get storms constantly. But it was a slow transition for me. I became a lawyer in 2003. I decided I was a writer 2011, I think. And I continued to practice until 2019, full time. So what I figured out was being a writer is more than a hobby, but it's often less than a job, and they won't pay all your bills when you're starting out. You're an artist, you're being creative. And so I said to myself, you know what? I'm gonna make these firms pay my expenses. So it's keep the job, keep writing the stories, try to get some things published, try and make a bigger project, see how it's gonna do. And I basically stopped practicing the same month that my first book came out. What did it give to me? It gave me a lot. And it was very helpful because I think before I became a lawyer all those years ago, as like a very nascent writer, I was very flowery. I was very undisciplined. I didn't write enough. I took too much time. I got discouraged. I think that being a lawyer taught me how to be much more analytical, have more gumption, stick to the task. And, you know, frankly, the biggest thing is, you know, being a lawyer does teach you how to argue both sides of any issue, or even like 20 sides of any issue.
Right.
People say that the characters feel so different. It's because it's not me. I'm like, okay, it's like being an actor doing the method. If I was this person in this spot, how would it be for me in this spot? And I think without being my lawyer self, because how my brain works, I could have done that. Not every writer needs that, but I needed that in my life.
And being a lawyer with billable hours, you're more efficient as a writer.
Oh yes. Oh yes, no doubt.
I think we'll have time for like one more question. How much research do you do for your writing, and do you enjoy it?
I have a very unusual research process. I'm a big proponent of knowing yourself. And I know that I love knowledge so much that I could like have an idea and like go to a library to stay there for the rest of my life. Just research for the next 20 or 30 years, never even write the book, you know? I had a mentor years ago named Wells Tower, and I read his first book, Everything Raps, Everything Burned. I was in his class, and I was like, you know, how do you even write all this stuff? Like, it's just so well researched. And he said, Wikipedia. I was like, what? And I admitted to him in that moment that I did the same thing. I would go on Wikipedia. You know, a lot of writers will like turn their Wi-Fi off. I write with my Wi-Fi on. I'm doing Wikipedia, I'm Googling, I'm doing YouTube the entire time. And so that's the fun for me. Like that discovery during the process of creating things is so much fun. So, you know, research shouldn't be ponderous. It shouldn't be overly done. It's just like get what you need and keep moving.
Yeah. Well, this has been a phenomenal conversation. I have been looking forward to it, you know, and so thankful that you invited me to be with you. Thank you for your generosity in your answers. As a writer, as a reader, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Oprah better watch out for you replacing her as the best interviewer in America. I really appreciate the questions. They were quite excellent.
Thank you.
And on the behalf of Politics and Prose, I would like to thank you both, Maurice and Tisha, for doing this event with us. We also like to thank our audience for tuning in. And we all ask, if you pick up the book today, please purchase it from Politics and Prose. The link is in the chat for the ones who don't say they love you. I've read it and it's also good. So yes, I can attest that the book is good and worth your time for reading. And thank you all for joining us this evening.
Good night.
Good night.